Stand beneath the arches of any old railway terminal and you'll feel it. That inexplicable disconnect. On one side, magnificent architecture reaching toward the heavens, soaring vaults, marble columns, granite worthy of the greatest temples. On the other side, a grimy steam locomotive belching clouds of black smoke. The contrast is jarring, absurd even, like watching someone use a supercomputer to crack walnuts. What if everything we've been told about these structures is backwards? What if these palaces were never meant for trains at all? What if the trains are just crude decorations we placed inside homes we never understood? The answers hide in details that seem trivial at first glance, details that completely shatter our comfortable understanding of the past. And the most obvious of these details is their impossible scale. Colossal doorways reaching 5 meters high, sometimes 8, gigantic windows, ceilings that disappear into shadows far overhead. Who were these spaces designed for? Certainly not for humans averaging 170 centimeters in height. Mainstream historians wave this away as architectural grandstanding, a pursuit of imperial magnificence. But in genuine engineering, where structures weigh thousands of tons of stone and steel, there's no room for meaningless gestures. Every element must serve a function. If doors 3 stories tall exist, someone walked through them. If service staircases have steps uncomfortably high for us, they were ergonomically perfect for someone else. Those mighty Atlas figures holding up the porticos of St. Petersburg buildings stop seeming like mythological decoration. They start looking like self-portraits. The builders leaving us a silent message about their actual stature. We move through their spaces like mice exploring an abandoned mansion, never noticing that door handles sit at our eye level. These cyclopean structures we call train stations were designed and constructed for fundamentally different users. This isn't speculation, it's a conclusion drawn from basic engineering analysis. Any structure, from a simple chair to a towering skyscraper, is created with its users' proportions in mind. And the proportions of these buildings scream that their users were significantly larger than us. Official academia dismisses this observation with convenient explanations about architectural posturing. Supposedly, this was how emperors and industrialists demonstrated power. But this narrative crumbles when confronted with elementary logic and physics. In engineering, where thousands of tons of stone and metal hang in the balance and the slightest miscalculation means catastrophe, there's no space for meaningless grandeur. Every arch, every column, every opening serves strict functional purposes. Constructing 8-meter-high doors requires colossal expenditure, materials, incredibly robust hinges, mechanisms capable of moving such massive weight. No rational architect would undertake such complications and cost. Increases purely for aesthetics if no practical need existed. That need becomes obvious when you descend into service areas of old terminals or climb their towers, places where ordinary passengers never tread. There you discover staircases extremely awkward for modern humans, steps either too tall, reaching 40 to 50 centimeters, transforming the climb into a strength exercise, or too narrow, preventing full foot placement. This isn't design error. This is ergonomics calculated for different stride lengths and body geometry. Ergonomics for beings approaching 3 meters in height. Suddenly those statues of Atlas figures and caryatids adorning facades from that era stop being mere tributes to ancient fashion. They become direct indicators, a kind of technical specification for the building, vividly demonstrating the appearance of its true builders and masters. Not mythical heroes, but realistic portraits of those for whom these palaces were homes or workplaces. We, by contrast, appear out of scale against their backdrop, like children who have tried on their father's coat. However, the question of who these builders were pales beside an even more fundamental mystery. Even if we momentarily accept this hypothesis, how could they have erected these masterpieces using the primitive technology of the 19th century? Official history asks us to believe a fairy tale about thousands of workers, with hammers, chisels, and wheelbarrows, constructing these complexes in record time. But the moment we examine logistics and materials science, this fairy tale disintegrates, exposing gaping voids in our understanding of the past. Even accepting the hypothesis of giant builders, we confront a wall of technological and logistical impossibilities that transform the official narrative of 19th century industrial revolution into absurdity. Let's abandon hammers and chisels momentarily and speak the language of numbers and engineering logic. Any major railway terminal, supposedly constructed in 2 to 3 years during the mid-1800s, consists of millions, potentially tens of millions, of fired bricks. Producing such volume requires gigantic factories operating in continuous cycles. Enormous clay quarries to supply these factories with raw materials. The sky above cities should have been black with smoke from thousands of firing kilns. Yet on old maps and plans, we don't observe industrial zones of such scale near construction sites. Even assuming these phantom factories existed, the next unsolvable problem emerges: logistics. The primary transport method of that era was horse-drawn cart with severely limited carrying capacity. Roads, if they existed at all, were muddy tracks. Transporting even 1 million bricks across such terrain becomes a logistical nightmare requiring decades and an army of carters and horses. Yet, we're asked to believe this was accomplished in a couple of years, simultaneously with delivering thousands of tons of granite, marble, and metal structures. The metal puts a final, definitive end to this story. The delicate arched roofs covering railway platforms are made from hundreds of tons of high-quality metal. According to textbooks, metallurgy in the 19th century was just emerging. Yet we observe structures whose execution quality astonishes even modern engineers. Millions of rivets holding these arches demonstrate incredible precision. Riveting technology requires heating metal to red-hot temperatures and instantly securing it with hammer or press strikes. How was this accomplished at heights of tens of meters without modern cranes, lifts, and safety equipment? Chemical analysis of metal from these old structures often reveals surprising alloy purity and the presence of alloying additives making it virtually immune to corrosion. Compare these beams, which have stood for a century and a half exposed to the elements, with modern metal fencing that rusts away within 10 to 15 years. This isn't merely good craftsmanship. This is lost technology, but even these colossal construction projects pale beside the truly cyclopean project of creating a global railway network. In the United States alone, over 30,000 miles of track were laid by 1860. By whom? By a population barely recovered from wars, using picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows? The volume of earthworks required is comparable to constructing the Great Wall of China, excavating soil, creating perfectly level embankments spanning meters, cutting tunnels through rock without dynamite. We're discussing billions of cubic meters of displaced earth. Here, the most inconvenient question emerges. Where did they put all this earth? Giant spoil heaps, mounds comparable to mountains, should surround the railways. But they don't exist. Moreover, many track sections are laid in strange, deep cuttings with perfectly straight walls, as though not dug by thousands of workers, but carved into the planet's body by a giant milling machine. Official history asks us to believe in miracles, in the incredible enthusiasm and labor achievements of our ancestors. But there's a much simpler, more frightening explanation that resolves all these contradictions at once. We didn't build these stations and roads. We found them. We discovered them upon arriving at the ruins of a more advanced world. And proof of this isn't hidden in secret archives, but exists in plain sight, literally beneath our feet. You need only walk around the perimeter of any major railway terminal supposedly built during the 19th century to observe full-sized windows half or even two-thirds buried in asphalt. Tour guides and architecture textbooks call these light wells for basement illumination. But consider the absurdity of this explanation. Why would an architect design a giant window, decorate it with intricate masonry and casings, then deliberately bury it underground, leaving only a narrow slit where dirt and water constantly accumulate? It's engineering madness. Nobody in their right mind would spend colossal resources decorating something destined for burial. The truth is far simpler and more logical. These aren't basement windows, they're ground floor windows. The train station buildings, like most historic structures in our city centers, are buried under several meters of soil. The official version calls this a cultural layer, supposedly accumulated over centuries because people didn't clean up after themselves. We're asked to believe that in 100 to 200 years, in imperial capitals where cleanliness was strictly enforced, a 2 to 3 meter layer of dirt could accumulate. This is a lie designed for those who have never considered sediment accumulation rates. The buried ground floors are direct, irrefutable proof of a catastrophic event. Torrents of liquid clay and mud covered the cities. Those who came after had to adapt the surviving upper floors, cutting new entrances into them. This explanation finds support in a second type of evidence: old engravings and photographs from the mid-19th century. The vast squares of St. Petersburg, Paris, and Rome appear absolutely empty. The majestic buildings stand, but there's no life within them. Only occasionally do solitary figures in simple clothing appear in the frame, looking out of place against these cyclopean structures. Historians explain the emptiness through long exposure times of old cameras, claiming moving people simply didn't register. But why then do these same pictures often show clear silhouettes of horse or trees swaying in wind? The truth is these cities were empty. Their builders disappeared as a result of catastrophe. The few people we see in photographs are the first settlers brought in to occupy vacant real estate. This theory allows all puzzle pieces to fit together. We didn't build these train stations and railways. We unearthed them. We are a civilization that arrived in a ready-made world, cleared ruins of dirt and clay, and adapted them for our own primitive needs. This simultaneously explains the fantastic construction speed, the absence of giant quarries and factories, and the strange straight trenches in which many railway lines are laid. The builders of the 19th century simply followed old routes, excavated surviving embankments, and laid new rails on foundations that had been compacted for centuries. We placed our primitive tracks where flows of a completely different kind of energy once moved. But if the stations are excavated buildings of a previous civilization, what were they really? Their true purpose was far more grandiose than simply waiting for trains. The similarity in design between train stations and cathedrals and temples isn't a tribute to fashion or architectural whim. It's functional necessity, a key to understanding their true role. In physics, a dome is the ideal shape for concentrating wave energy and accumulating static charge. It's not just a beautiful roof, but a technical device, a resonator. If you examine old images of train stations before so-called 20th century reconstructions, you notice one striking detail. Atop their spires and domes are not flags or crosses, but complex metal structures. Spheres, grids, multi-pronged arrays. These aren't decorations. These are receiving antennas. These terminals were designed to collect atmospheric electricity, the very same free energy of the ether that Nikola Tesla spoke of, and which has been meticulously erased from all official physics textbooks. We're not looking at individual buildings, but at surviving nodes of a gigantic global energy system. Train stations, cathedrals, and town halls linked into a unified network, functioning as power plants and distributors. When old buildings from this era are demolished, hidden metal frameworks are often discovered inside walls, which official science dismisses as reinforcement. But these were conductors. The dome antenna collected charge from the ionosphere. The metal framework transmitted it downward. The massive granite columns containing quartz acted as piezoelectric elements, converting and stabilizing this energy. The entire station is a giant machine. That's why these enormous halls were bright and warm without any visible sources. Recall descriptions of balls and receptions in the 19th century, where the air in halls glowed on its own. We're told this was gaslighting, but any engineer will tell you that a gas flame cannot produce bright, even illumination, capable of lighting a room with ceiling heights of 30 to 40 meters. This was different technology. Gas pipes and electrical wires were installed much later, barbarically cutting into magnificent marble finishes and disfiguring walls just to somehow illuminate these vast spaces once the free energy of the ancients was shut off. But energy collection was only one function of these complexes. The excessive height and enormous internal volume weren't needed to vent smoke from a steam locomotive. A simple chimney would suffice for that. This volume was necessary for resonance. We now approach another truly shocking technology of the ancients: acoustic levitation. Sound is vibration. Vibration at specific frequencies can alter the properties of matter and space. The entire geometry of train stations, the proportions of arches, the shape of vaults, the finishing materials, all perfectly tuned to generate and sustain standing sound waves. Perhaps the transport vehicles of that civilization didn't run on rails shaking the ground. Perhaps they moved through space using acoustic corridors, levitating in powerful sound fields. And the giant arches of stations weren't merely entrances, but portals, entry and exit points from this global transportation network. We, like savages who found a microscope and started using it to hammer nails, laid primitive iron rails inside these portals, and ran our clattering, smoking carts along them. But if this was such an advanced civilization, possessing free energy and perhaps portal technology, what happened to it? And who are we in this world, having inherited only fragments of its former greatness? The answer to this question lies in the darkest and most diligently suppressed phenomenon of the 19th century. Historical chronicles record a strange and frightening phenomenon known as the orphan trains. In the United States, Europe, and Russia, hundreds of thousands of orphaned children were loaded onto railway carriages and sent from what we're told were overcrowded cities to settle new territories. The Wild West, Siberia, sparsely populated lands. This raises an uncomfortable but logical question. Where did such a colossal number of orphans suddenly come from? Official history vaguely references epidemics and poverty, but these explanations don't withstand scrutiny. No epidemic selectively eliminates the adult population while leaving children unharmed. Poverty doesn't lead to hundreds of thousands of children simultaneously losing not only their parents but all other relatives as well. Grandparents, uncles, aunts. The numbers simply don't add up. Such a demographic explosion of orphanhood is possible in only one case: if the adult population was eliminated almost instantly as a result of a global event. Here we arrive at a shocking hypothesis that inverts our entire conception of ourselves. We are the descendants of these orphans. Our civilization was raised in a kind of incubator on the ruins of the previous one. Our memories, like those of children with clean slates, were erased. We were given a new, fabricated history. We were told fairy tales about our great ancestors who built this world, with picks and shovels so that we wouldn't ask questions about who really built it. We were made to believe in linear progression, from digging stick to steam engine, to hide the fact of monstrous regression. In light of this hypothesis, the magnificent train stations acquire a new, sinister function. They weren't points of departure for exciting journeys. They were giant distribution centers, sorting points for the surviving biological material, the children who were brought in from everywhere after the Great Reset. Picture this scene. Trains filled with frightened children arrive at these magnificent stations. The children step onto platforms, look up, and see these cyclopean vaults, thinking they were created by the great ancestors from their new textbooks. They don't know that their parents disappeared during the catastrophe that destroyed the previous world. That's why these buildings evoke subconscious anxiety and emptiness in us. It's not just fatigue from noise and crowds. It's the cry of our genetic memory, which knows the true purpose of this place. This is not a place for travel, but a place of exodus, a place where the fate of our species was decided. When we're inside, we enter the field of a giant resonator that has long been detuned. It no longer harmonizes space, but functions as a suppressor of will and consciousness. The authorities intuitively understand this property. It's no coincidence that during any unrest or coup, the first places seized are train stations. Control over a station is control over the vibrational background of an entire city. This reset, which created armies of orphans, wasn't a random natural disaster. It was the result of a global war, traces of which can still be found on the very walls of these buildings if you know where to look. You don't need to search secret archives. Look at the facades of train stations themselves and adjacent old buildings. A careful examination reveals strange plumage that cannot be explained by normal erosion or local fires. We're talking about melted bricks, granite with clear flow marks, stones that in places have turned into glassy mass. Historians and restorers attribute this to fire effects, but this explanation fails a basic physics check. The temperature of burning wood or coal in a typical city fire doesn't exceed 800 to 900 degrees Celsius. For granite, the hardest natural mineral, to start flowing like wax requires temperatures over 1,200 to 300 degrees. Moreover, the impact must be instantaneous and incredibly powerful. These aren't traces of ordinary fire. These are scars left on the planet's body by the use of high-tech weapons, comparable in effect to thermonuclear or plasma weapons. Our train stations and the historic centers of our cities are silent witnesses to a global war that instantly destroyed the previous civilization. In this context, we should rethink the so-called Great Fires of the 19th century. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the burning of Moscow in 1812, the devastating fires in San Francisco, Seattle, Boston. They all followed the same strange scenario. Cities built predominantly of stone and brick burned to the ground to their very foundations, with not only metal but also stone melting. The official explanations for causes always sound ridiculously absurd. A cow knocked over a kerosene lamp, and an entire metropolis burned down as a result. Can you believe that a city of stone can be destroyed by a single lamp? This was an accident. This was targeted cleanup. Those districts and cities too badly damaged in the global catastrophe, which couldn't be restored or excavated, were simply razed to the ground, wiped from the earth to hide the true scale of destruction and to build new primitive boxes for a new amnesiac population. But the train stations were left standing. Why? Because they survived. These buildings were originally designed and built as fortified strongholds, as bunkers, their incredibly thick walls, their foundations buried several stories deep, their lead linings between blocks, which restorers sometimes mention. All these are elements of protection against shock waves and penetrating radiation. They were too valuable as nodes of control and communication, as surviving islands of ancient technology. That's why they stood where everything else was turned to ruins. That's why they became crystallization centers for our new primitive civilization, which was grown on these ashes. Now, with all puzzle pieces in place, the final, most disturbing picture of our world emerges. We live in a world of stage sets, using remnants of technology from a great civilization that was systematically destroyed. Our entire official history is a lie written by the victors of that last war. A tale spun by looters who were first to seize surviving knowledge and technology, who appropriated these palaces and called themselves kings, presidents, and tycoons. Look how ridiculous and out of place they appear against the backdrop of architecture their ancestors supposedly created. A modern leader giving a speech before giant columns of the Capitol, or Kremlin, looks like a man wearing a jacket 5 sizes too large. This discrepancy permeates our entire culture. We build structures of glass and concrete that will crumble to dust in 50 years. We do so beside eternal granite embankments that have stood for centuries. We call the creation of disposable things progress, having forgotten the secrets of everlasting alloys. We are a civilization of degradation, not progress. And the main witness to this is the gaping chasm between our technological level and the level of those who erected these train stations. We've been made to believe we evolved from primitive stick to smartphone to kill our very sense of greatness. So we'd never ask the simple question, why can't we, with all our computers and lasers, build the same way? The answer is simple. Because we've lost the technology, the knowledge, and perhaps the very genetic ability to create at the level of gods. We've been turned into consumers, herded into concrete cells, and given 8-hour workdays so we have no time to lift our heads and truly examine the vaults of a train station. These star maps frozen in stone, but the traces remain everywhere, in the giant doors, in windows that have sunk underground, in polygonal masonry that's impossible to replicate. It's time to stop believing textbooks and start looking around. Train stations aren't just transport hubs. They're stone witnesses for the prosecution, silent reproaches to our blindness, and the main key to understanding who we really are. Every time you buy a train ticket, you pass through a portal that wasn't made for you. You're entering the territory of a foreign, departed god. And the system fears that one day you'll stop, in the middle of the main hall, look up at the dome, and understand everything without a word. Perhaps one day we'll indeed understand how to turn their machines back on.